This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so in last session, I think we completed so understanding about this some of the global value providers. These things in projects on day-to-day we use, especially using static resources, using custom tables. These things mostly we use in the projects day-to-day. Today, let's understand about a concept called component IDs. So what are there are two types of IDs. So local ID and the global ID. Global ID will be generated by Salesforce internally. Local ID as a developer we give and use that to recognize the lightning elements, lightning standard lightning component elements. Okay, so I have created one of the Aura component. If you see component IDs, this is a component. Here, let me define one of the button and show you. So when we say these component IDs, these are not related to HTML elements, right? So let's say if I give like this, okay, this is not the lightning component, right? So this component ID deals with the lightning components, either the standard component or the custom component. So what we define, okay, not the HTML elements. Okay, so one of the lightning element, if you see all the lightning standard components, whatever available, you can see in the component library. You can open the component library. So left side under Aura. So all these are the standard lightning components, right? So on these, we can use those IDs to recognize. So those components won't recognize ID. Maybe if it is HTML element, I can give ID. So I can recognize that. But the standard lightning component cannot be assigned with ID. Okay, so for that I'm defining one button. Okay, so lightning colon button. So maybe really no need to type. Practically everything you can copy paste and make changes. Okay, so you can go to this lightning button and copy from there, right? So if you want to type, you can type. It's up to you. So let's say for our demo, um, maybe label I'm giving as action one. Okay, so name I'm giving as button one. The label is what we see. Name is internally to maintain uniqueness. So this is a lightning button, and if you want to write the variant is equal to brand, some other values are there. To see the supported values, again we need to go to button and you see the supported attributes, right? So for variant, go to specification. For variant, the possible values, brand, brand outline, destructive, right? So base. So these are the some of the um, values. Okay, so always we can refer that and use. So this is one button. I'm also defining one more button. Okay, so now let's say action 2. Internally name I'm giving as button 2. So maybe style I'm giving as base. Okay, so now we have the two buttons. Okay, so now how uniquely we identify this? If you see attributes, you don't see any attribute called ID. Okay, so you don't find anything called ID. If you give ID and try to access, it will say that attribute is not available. So to recognize this, we use like this Aura ID. Okay, this one we call as local ID, right? As a developer, to identify that standard lightning element, we are giving some ID. Okay, so we have to give with Aura ID. Yeah, this is the one in documentation, whatever they refer local ID. Okay, so here I'm giving ID as button one. Okay, and also here I'm giving the name as ID as button two. Okay, so now when we click on this one, so let's say how I'm going to define one function to call and click on this button. Okay, so I'm opening controller JS. Okay, now we have this component, and from here in the same bundle, the controller JS is there. From here, I want to call this action, right? So let's say I'm giving the name as do action. This one I don't want to type this much. This I'm renaming to CMP. So now to call that one, okay, from the UI, if you want to call the controller JS function, so when exactly you want to call, on click, right? On click and on double click. So we have different actions, the JavaScript events. For that we call on click. Okay, so dynamically to call we use like this, and to call the controller function C dot. That C means JavaScript controller, name of the function, right? The function name is do action, right? So now when we click on this button, so this will be called, right? So now how to identify this element, this button I want to identify. For that, so we use Aura find, right? So one of the feature. So Aura find means based on the local ID, we can recognize the element, the standard element on the UI. For that, so whatever our component, whatever name we give here, dot find, and here we have to give the ID, right? So here button one. Okay. So now due to this, what will happen? It will identify this entire element. That entire element information will come here. Okay, maybe to show you. So just printing here console.log. Okay, so now let's save this lightning component. So left side, click on the right in this bundle folder, right click and deploy. So this is the way how we deploy. Okay, so it is deployed. So now let's go back and see. Okay, so for us to see that, maybe for now I'm removing this whatever existing our component name, component IDs, right? So I'm including that component in the application and seeing the preview. Right. So I have two buttons, right? Action 1 and action 2. These two buttons are there. Okay, so right click and inspect to see what we are printing in the log. We'll go to the browser console, inspect and click on console. Okay, maybe to avoid confusion, clear the existing. Now on click on this, we are calling this, right? On click C dot to action, it will call and it will print this. If it is not able to recognize this element, it will say undefined. Right? So click on this now. If you see here, so all that element information it is giving. but we don't want all the element information, right? So what I want from this element, let's say, so I want to get the name of this element for this component. Here name is one of the attribute, right? So I want to access this attribute value. We know that it is button one. Same thing I want. Okay, so for that, so after finding, right, whatever the result is there, dot. So if you want to access attribute value, so we are trying to access this button attribute value. For that, we use v, one of the value provider. So v means view. If you want to access any attribute value, so always we need to use v dot, so name of the attribute, right? Now for us, this is a component which is a standard component. Already we identified that component. In this component, we need this attribute value, right? To access that, let's say dot get. Okay, so here within the single quote or double quote, v dot name of the attribute. Name is the name of the attribute. Now due to this, what it will give? It will give the name of this. Okay, so only with practice you can easily understand. Okay, in case of any confusion, please let me know. So I'm trying to spend some time and make sure that you understand in a better way. Okay, so let's see. For that, first we need to deploy this. Right click on the entire folder and deploy. Now what we get, so here refresh. So now click on this one. What you are seeing, for this action one button, internally the name is button one. At same value we are able to see, right? So this is the way, right? This is the way how we deal with the Aura find, and we can find the element using the Aura find to identify lightning component with Aura ID. So we are using that. Okay, so now in the same way, now, so what I want, what will happen if there are duplicates, right? Sometimes if you keep this in the iteration and generate these buttons, okay, that time maybe same ID will be there. And also here one of the point, it is not possible to give the dynamic value for this ID. You cannot give the dynamic expression. Okay, that is one of the limitation. Okay, so let's say in case if there are multiple elements, multiple lightning components, so with the internally this is a lightning component, right? Multiple lightning components with the same ID. So let's see what will happen. Again, I'm deploying this one. Deploy. Go back. Just to refresh. And I click on this. Right. So component dot find is not a function. Let's see. So what is wrong here? It's not a function. Right here we did not touch anything. Right? We just right. So clicked here. Now the problem is due to this duplicate ID, right? So same ID, there are two elements. So due to this, when you say component dot find, what is happening? It is returning the array of elements, right? With that ID, if there are multiple matches, whatever it gives is the array. Okay, array dot get. For array there is no get, and v dot name is not there. Okay, that's why is not a function, right? So sometimes we feel it awkward as well. So that's the reason for that. Okay, now how to avoid? Okay, so now instead of keeping this like this part, okay, so maybe here I'm defining in one of the variable. Okay, so I'm defining component 1 equal to, right, otherwise button component 1. I'm storing the result into this one. So now this can be a single value, right? So about maybe constant let where. So maybe I am going to provide few JavaScript basic sessions to you. If you watch those, for sure, I believe you will easily understand why we use constant let where. In general, constant means so only one time we assign the value. Later, again, assigning is not possible. But if you want, you can alter the existing value. Okay, it's like that. Okay, so now I'm storing into this. Now, if there is only one element, so that element will be here. Okay, let's say if there are multiple elements identified with the same ID, you will see the array here. Okay, so if it is array, how it should work? It is not array, how it should work. So first of all, if there is no element, whatever we are trying to find, if it is not there, let's say it is hidden due to some condition, then you will see some undefined, right? Undefined dot get, again it will produce error. Okay, so first of all, is something is there or not? First we need to do that validation, right? So here in JavaScript, we have truthy and falsy values. Okay, so falsy means 0, null, right? If you assign a variable and if nothing is there, by default it is undefined. So all those are the falsy values. So other than that, if any other thing is a truthy value, right? So let's say if there is some content, at least one button or multiple buttons are there, right? So directly if you say this, the result of this one is true. If this is having value as undefined or 0 or empty, in those situations the value of this one is false, and we say falsy. Okay, so now that's why we don't check is equal to null, is equal to empty. I'm not checking, right? If giving, right, as soon as it is not undefined, not 0, not empty, if some value is there, it will enter inside. Okay, but that won't solve our problem. So here again we have two conditions. Only if one value is there, then we need to proceed with this syntax. Okay, if there are multiple, so that is an array, right? We need to iterate and identify. Okay, so now, so here I'm checking one more if condition. This button component, right? So it can be one or multiple. So to know the size, right? If it is an array in JavaScript, to know the size of the array, we use length. Okay, if the length is greater than 0, right? Or maybe if it is equal to 1, okay, only one element is there. So then the syntax is correct, right? Else if maybe, right? If length is greater than 1, greater than 1, that means more than one element is there. So that time it is an array, right? So maybe here again and again to avoid repeating, I'm storing into this, right? I'm storing this whatever we found into this one dot. In case of single element like this, in case of multiple elements, it will go to else if. Let's say here, so I want to write multiple statements. I'm using the block. So there can be multiple buttons, right? I want to iterate over each and every button and print the value. Okay, so now for okay like this, and if you want to iterate over that, okay, so I'm iterating I equal to 0. Here I want to modify the I value, so that's why I'm taking let. Okay, so I is equal to 0, I less than component 1, I plus plus. Okay, so I'm iterating over each and every element, and that ID I want. Okay, maybe same thing I'm printing, but this time it is having multiple, right? Array. So first 0th index element, second index element, all those names we are getting and printing. Okay, so that is what we are doing. Okay, I believe you are able to understand. If you are not able to understand, let me know. Okay, so now let's deploy. Right click and deploy. So deploy. Now just refresh. Okay, now we have multiple, right? So multiple buttons will be identified, and I'm expecting, but I'm not seeing anything. Okay, so let me see what is wrong. So this button component dot length greater than 1.
The button component 1 is dot length. The 4, the statement.
So this one.
No, in the 4 statement, button component 1 dot length. No, the next one.
Yeah, button 1 is there. Right? Button
no,
1
I mean
is
in
there.
the for loop. So
for loop.
E minus is less than dot length.
Yeah. Length. We are missing length. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are missing length. Okay, so it is less than length. Okay, somehow I missed that. So deploy. Now let's just refresh. Now click on this. Okay, now if you see button 1 and the button 2, right, it is able to identify based on the ID. So there are two matches based on these IDs. It is able to identify both, and it is giving the values button 1 and the button 2. Okay, that is how it works. Maybe if it is only one identification, right? Now let's say only one is there. Now how it behaves, let's see. And also line by line, if you want to understand, so where exactly it is going, is it going into this one or this one? So line by line, if you want to understand. So what we do as a developer, to sometimes we don't know in which line there is a problem. We use debugger. We just keep debugger. Okay, and first okay, I'm deploying this entire component. So this component, right click and deploy. Okay, so now it is deployed. Now just refresh. Okay, now only one match is there, right? And also since again the debugger will be effective only when you are inspect mode. Only when you right click and inspect, then only debugger will be activated. Otherwise, normally if you are seeing the preview, sorry, yeah, now click here Now, since we opened this inspector, it is started. We'll see where line by line when you click on this, we see where it is. Right, started. It started here. Now it is executing this one. Right. So run it. So now, if you see this, it is identified. Something is there. Right. So now, so right, because something is there, it is entered. It is a truthy value and length. Right. So I think right, by this time I think it is not entered here. Right. It is not entered here. It is not entered. It is not entered anywhere. Right. So nothing happened. Right. So even it is not able to enter. Right. So length is equal to 1. Okay. So it's better to, I think, give greater than 0. It is even not entered into this. Okay. So just I'm changing. It should be greater than 0. Then it will enter here. So let me check now. So somehow, sometimes when you see what is going wrong, this is the way we add debugger and test it. Come on, clicking here. Fine, and greater than 1, greater than 0. Dot length. This length is coming as undefined. Okay, that's why it is not entered here. And we are not seeing anything printing. Okay. So somehow, if it is not array, right? So only if it is array, length will work. But if this element is not array, length is not going to work. Okay, so that's why I don't want to use length if it is not array. So we need to change our logic. Okay, so here what I will do, just cutting length, that will work only for array. What is happening, since we don't have multiple elements identified, it's returning only one. Now it is fine, and else, that in else situation, so that means it is not array, there is a single element. If it is single element, so I can give here, and so that it should work. Okay, so like that we have to think and do that. Let's maybe deploy.
Shinu, can you explain what let is in the for loop?
Yeah, let is a, so in JavaScript we don't mention any data type, right? So in a generic way, how we can define either general when you deal either var or let or constant. These types we just mention. Okay, so when you define a JavaScript variable, since we don't define any data type, just we say var or let or constant. Var means the scope of the variable is global, right? Even outside the function, so it is not block scope. It is a like a global scope. Maybe in my JavaScript basics you will understand. Okay, so global scope, and it is a block scope. Like in Apex, how our variable scope is there, same way. This is dangerous. So that's why nowadays in modern JavaScript, always it is recommended to use let. Okay, and both either var or let allows to modify the value, right? Allows to reassign values. You can reassign values again and again, right? So, but constant, it is once you assign value, no need to, you cannot again reassign. Okay, reassigning value is not possible. But whatever value is there, you can alter that value. Okay, maybe when we can alter if it is an object or array, the value of the constant variable is an object or array. We can alter that array values. We can alter that object values. Okay, so it's like that. So mostly we use constant if you don't have any requirement to modify. If there is a requirement to modify, we take let. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So here I am taking constant, right? So here whatever it gives is an object or array. Okay. So you can access or even you can alter, but reassigning is not possible. But here in for loop I am taking let because this will modify that I value. We should allow to modify that value. That's why we take let. Okay, it's like that. Okay. So now I think let's deploy now and test it. Just click on this. Now again debugger is activated, entered, and that is undefined. Right now it is entered here. Now you see the value printed by this time, right? So that is a way. But every time we don't activate because we don't like to see every time. If there is a need, that is the way. Okay. So that's it. Now one more thing I want to explain. So sometimes, right, we have event. When you see here we have event, right? What is the use of this event? Okay, so when you interact with some element on the UI, let's say here we have two buttons. Which button we are clicking? As a user, I can click on any button. At runtime, on which button I am clicking, that button information I want to get and access. That is possible using event. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, so I'm going to call the same function for this button also. Okay, so now what I will do, dynamically I'll recognize what is the button clicked and done. So let's say that button, which button I clicked, that button ID I want, this ID. Okay, so let's see so how we do that. Both are calling same function, right? So maybe different function means we know. Do action 1, do action 2 means we know action 2 means it is calling for button 2. But for multiple elements, when you are invoking same function, but in the function we should recognize on which button the event is applied, on click or on change or whatever we use. Okay, so for that we have we have event.get source. Okay, and again if it is JavaScript, let's say if you do the action here in JavaScript to identify, we use event.target. Okay, but this is not the this is a HTML element, but this is not the HTML element. This is the lightning element, lightning component. To apply the event and get the event related information, we use event.get source. Okay, so maybe so I'm also, let's say, calling same thing here. Okay, just to show you. Okay, for all these elements, when we click, it's going to call the same. Here I will show you. Okay. So event means the click event. Okay, there are again other meanings of events. So here, if it is a lightning element, lightning button, lightning card, such kind of things, we use event dot. So here, whatever the name we give, that one, right? Event dot get source. So this is the way we give, right? So like this will identify that element, the entire element, right? So now this, from this entire element, whatever it is identified, I want this ID, RID, but dot RID, it is not possible to get like that. Okay, so this we technically call as local ID, right? So we can say dot get local ID. So this is the method to get the ID of that. Okay, let's see. So console dot log, I'm just printing, and this I'll show you what it will print out. So here deploy, go back and refresh, click on that. So now if you see button one, right? So what exactly we are identifying? Get local ID. Get local ID is this RID, right? I clicked on button one, that's why it is giving button one, right? So if I click on this and button two, it is giving, right? So it is able to recognize. Okay, so what if, let's say, maybe not the ID of this, I want the value of this label. I want the label of that button, right? So again, if you want the label of that, so what we do here, instead of get local ID, now until here it is like which element we clicked, that entire element. If you want to get the one of the attribute value, how to get the attribute value of a component? Always it is v dot, right? Dot get. Here we have to say v dot, right? Name, right? Label is the attribute name, right? It will get that. Okay, so maybe let me deploy and show you. Deploy. It is deployed. Just refresh. Just I'm clearing. Now if I click here, right? Label is also giving, right? Action one is the label. Here action two is the label. Sorry. So it is giving. Okay, so now if I click here, what will happen? We are getting error. Event dot get source is not a function, right? So when you are dealing with the HTML elements, this won't work. So now how to avoid that error? Okay, so now here we say if event dot get source, if something is there in this event, then only go inside and do this, right? Else, so right, when we click on this, nothing is there. That means we are assuming it is a HTML element. If it is a HTML element, right? So to recognize that, what we do, console.log event.target. Okay, so event.target means, so on which element we click, that element, the HTML element, it will identify, right? In our case, we are clicking here, but I want the content which is inside that h1 tag, right? So if you want to get the content inside that, we have text content, dot text content. So when we use that, so what is the content inside that h1 tag? Now if you see this, this is the content of that h1 that it will return. Okay, so now in both ways it should not give error. Okay, so now again right click in the deploy, Go back and just refresh. Just to remove. So click on that. Right now, click on this. Now we are not facing an issue. Now click on this. Right, to see what is the content inside the component IDs. Right, same thing it is giving. Right, like that. Okay, we should know as a developer. So when we use get source, when we use target, those kind of things. Okay, so that's the main about this example. And anyway, the global ID, right? The global ID will be auto generated by Salesforce, right? So now to get that global ID, so here CMP means our current component, right? Component ID is the custom component what we created, that one, right? To get the global ID of that one, console.log and get and print component dot get global ID. Get global ID. So this is the one. So let's see what is the ID it is. Okay. And also, if you see, this is also right. This is also a component, right? So maybe here also same thing. I'm copying here. I think we have only one ID. This is also a standard component, right? So what is the global ID that of that? Let's see. Right click, deploy, go back, maybe just to refresh. Okay, so now, right now global ID 70 for this button 7:0 for this 3:0. For our current component, this is the global ID. For that button, this is the global ID. Right, when you click on this, for this second button, right, maybe both are lightning buttons only. This is also lightning button standard component. This is also lightning button standard component. If you see, both are having different IDs. So that will be auto generated by Salesforce, and it will be so given by Salesforce. Right? So I think both are giving same result, right? Okay, anyway, so what is happening? This here we are only identifying button one. That's why always it is giving the same. So maybe here if I give that, I think it will be more meaningful. Okay, so now let me give here. Here, this is the button component what we dynamically clicked. So that global ID I'm trying to get. Okay, so let's maybe go back and refresh. Now make sure that it will recognize what is the button we click. Right, so 70 is I think due to this line number 24. You can also see line due to this one. It is printed 70. Okay, now let's click on this. So now if you see for this action to, there is a different global ID, right? So same instance, both are same components, but system for each instance of the component, system generates a unique global ID. So that's the concept. Okay. So just nowadays the reason, right, why I'm explaining all this in interviews, people are asking. Okay. So this will be useful for our interview also. So that's about this. So we're done with this. understanding these features as part of this component. Okay, so any questions on this so far? Okay, so one of the next type. So we have to understand about the data types. In the process of explaining about data types, I explain about few different topics. Okay, so that's why here maybe I'm going to create this data types component. So what is happening once I create many child components and all those things? People are confusing, and I'm switching within one component. You'll see 3 or 4 files. Another component, 2 or 3 files, like that. Okay, to avoid that, so clearly I'm going to create this top level component, but inside that, okay, so here I'm also listing what are the other components I'm going to develop as part of this example. Okay, inside this data types, I'm going to use this one of the child component. This is also at same level, one of the child component. But within this child component, we are going to again create this child component. The same way within this, we are going to create one more child component. And this component is using a class. Okay, I'm associating this class to that component. Okay, so just that way you know how it is, right? This is we call as component composition, right? This is one component. Inside that, this one and this one, two top level components. If you open this component, you will see it is included in that. If you open this, you see it is included in that. You see this class is related to associated to this component. Okay, so after I explain, I recommend you to open these components and see so what I explain. Okay, to have more clarity and just maintaining all this. Okay, so now these are the topics we are going to understand. So as part of the data types, we have different basic types like string, number, date, right? So all those types are there. Maybe I'm going to explain about those types. Okay, you can also refer the documentation. Maybe I take one or two types and explain how it works for each basic type, function type, and other types. Okay, so now let's create the top level component Aura. VS Code to create, we search for Aura component. So click on Aura component, and here I'm giving. So maybe let me maintain the same name, data types. That's the component name. Okay. So now, so if you see, when we define the attribute, in general, if you want to show any information on the UI with the Aura framework, so all that information we have to store in the attribute. Directly the related controller, right? In JavaScript, whatever the values we have in the variables, accessing those is not possible. Okay? So the data should be assigned to one of the attribute. Only from attribute we read the data and show on the UI. So that's the concept. Okay. So to define the attribute, so we use Aura attribute. Name of the attribute, it is like a variable, right? So what is the name of the variable you want to give? Okay, so let's say I want to maintain list of certifications, right? So I'm taking. So you want to maintain only one certification, then type equal to string, right? String, right? So date. So all those are the basic data types available. You can see documentation for full list of available data types. Okay. So type and so here only these two are required. Maybe if you want to assign default value, you can assign. If you want to give description, you can give. If you want to make it required, you can make it required. But only this for this only these two attributes are required. Okay. So let's say I want array at multiple values. We can give like this. This is an array. It will hold multiple values. Right. So let's say certifications. Right. So when you have multiple values, how we give multiple values? Right. In array, each and every value. Right. So let's say admin, comma. So let's say PD1. So like that. PD2. So like this we can. So that's the default. Okay. If it is a single element, this is the default. Right. I mean, for that I think no need to give that like this. Okay. So it's like that. So anyway, now this is a attribute having the list of that array of string values. So let's say I want to iterate and show. Okay. So if you want to iterate, so far I think we did not discuss about the iteration, right? Iteration is one of the common, right? Or iteration, common need when we work as a developer. So to iterate, maybe in Visual Force we use apex repeat. Here we use Aura iteration. Okay, so iteration. Maybe in Visual Force apex repeat, we give the list in value attribute. Here we have to give the list, whatever the values you want to store, that we have to store in items, one of the attribute. Now dynamically to refer the attribute, we use like this. Now, if you remember, right, any attribute, even our component attribute or standard component attribute, if you want to refer attribute, we have to use v, one of the value provided, right? So v dot name, right? This is the name of the attribute. So that means we are referring to this attribute and all values will be there. From that, where each and every value, here we give some name, whatever we feel. And I'm giving like this as a developer. And inside that, I want to maybe show that value. Like this I'm showing. Okay, maybe instead of showing as a plain text, right, I want to keep in a list. In HTML, if you want to show the list of values, we use ordered list OL or UL like that. Okay. So let's say unordered list I am taking. Inside the unordered list, we have to maintain each and every element. Li means each and every value in the unordered list. So I'm enclosing this Li. That way it will show everything in a list. Just
Your
a
voice is
little.
audible.
Sorry, if
Voice
my
is
voice
better
is
clear.
not audible, for everyone it is same.
Yes, Shreya, for a second it wasn't there.
Okay, so is it fine now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Okay, so now just all I am doing, I am iterating, right? Iterating over the elements and showing. This is one of the basic example for that. And also maybe instead of leaving like this, when we deal on day to day using card, right? I think yesterday also I showed you how we use the card. It is very common. I'm using one of the standard lightning component, lightning card. So maybe really no need to by heart and maybe type like this. Okay, you can go to component library and copy this. Okay, if you remember, you can give card and maybe the title for the card I'm giving as, so let's say certifications, like this. Okay. Now let's see how it looks. Okay, so I'm just deploying. Make sure to click on the folder and deploy. Okay, so now let's go here. Now our component is changed, right? Now we are going to deal with the other component. So here data types. Data types. So click on update preview. See, right, you are seeing this is the card, and that we have all these values. Maybe if you want to see these values right side, we can apply the padding, right? I think yesterday for one of our component already we used padding, I think, right? Maybe quickly you can copy from there, or you can go to right, padding arrow, right? I want this. Okay, copy, or you have to go to Lightning Design System and go to left side utilities. Under utility, right? You see padding. Okay, so from here I need to see, right? Since quickly it is there, I have copied from there. This entire list I want to show right side, right? For this I'm applying that style. Okay, so right click and deploy. So go back and just refresh. Okay, so looks like it is not applied. I'm not dead list. Okay, so sometimes maybe for UL element maybe it is not applying. So I am going to keep this in div. Okay, and see. I click and deploy. Go back. Just refresh. Okay, now you are seeing right side. Okay, so like that. Okay, this is just one of the basic data type. So we have other types. Function type. Okay, so this one is something special. On day to day, we don't really deal with this, but in interviews nowadays, people are asking. Right? Whichever we don't deal day to day, so maybe right, for interview sake, people try to ask questions. Okay, maybe if you know, really, if you encounter such kind of situation, we can also use in our project. Okay, so function type. So the data type, right? When we define the attribute, here we have maybe string and maybe integer and date like that. So here we also have a type called function. Okay, but that function type, it won't work. You cannot define when we use our component directly. Okay, so there is a feature called Aura method. The Aura method is one of the standard component from Salesforce. When you use Aura method, one of the Salesforce standard component, that time inside that we can create a attribute with the type function. Okay, but not for regular components what we develop. Okay, so first of all, what is that Aura method? What is the purpose of that Aura method? One of the standard component that we have to understand. Okay, so high level, the purpose of that Aura method is from parent component, right? We have parent component and we have child component. From parent component, if you want to call a function, right, one of the JavaScript function which is present in the child component, in those situations, right? Maybe I click on a button on the parent component. In general, when we click on button on the parent component, we can call the function which is in the parent component. That it is a regular way. But there is a need to call the child component function. In those situations, we use Aura method. So I think since we don't have time, in our next session, so we are going to create that. Okay, in that process, right? If you see here, we create a parent and child and understand. And also, when we use this Aura method, are you calling a child function, child component function, which is having the only JavaScript logic, or maybe if the child component function is calling one of the apex method. Calling the apex method is a asynchronous process. Right? So mainly that time, so system needs to wait, right? Because when the parent component calls the child component function, parent component needs to wait for child component function whenever it returns the response. But JavaScript won't work like that, waiting. Okay. So in JavaScript, there is a concept called callback. It will call, but whenever that completes, that response it will set back to, again, it will call the function and supply that value into the parent component. So maybe once I create that tomorrow, maybe on Monday, you will understand that. Okay. We are going to understand that. Okay. And a few other topics. Okay. So before ending today, so any questions, anyone? Okay. So now, so what I am going to
Srini, Monday link will be changed, right?
Yeah, Monday for sure. From Monday, link will be there. You can maybe check your email.
Yeah.
Okay. And also, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a GitHub repo for this, and I'll be adding your emails into that. So accept that. So going forward, what I'll do, maybe even though I give org access, you cannot access developer console with the read-only mode. Again, so some problems will be there. So what I do, so whatever I develop, I will push into the GitHub repository. And from your side, whatever we developed, maybe you can open that repository and see the code. And that repository you can also pull into your project. Okay, maybe that procedure I will show you so that you can make use of our code and maybe meet it. Okay, but again, yeah, just understand. I'm going to show that share the repository privately. Okay, maybe as soon as we have access, I think we can pull. We will do that. Okay, so instead of sending email code daily, it is better. Okay, that is about how I provide the code access. So as usual, maybe this notes I'm keeping in the org. Okay, I'll maybe create a tab called Aura Notes. You can click on App Launcher and you can access that. Okay, so maybe you can do that. Okay, so before ending today, any questions, anyone? Okay, we'll continue on Monday. Thank you.